IVM.
Hello and welcome to the Ganatantra podcast. I am Sariyu Natarajan.
And I'm Alok Prasanna Kumar.
And in this week's episode, we are joined by Dr. Ornit Shani. Ornit is a senior lecturer at the Department of Asian Studies at the University of Haifa, and she is a scholar of the politics and modern history of India. Ornit received her PhD from the University of Cambridge. She was a research fellow at the St. John's College, Cambridge University. Her current research focuses on the modern history of democracy and citizenship in India. Her most recent book is How India Became Democratic, Citizenship and the Making of the Universal Franchise. As of yesterday, we're recording the day after the Bangalore Literary Fest, won the Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay New India Foundation Book Award. Dr. Ornit has just completed work on an Israeli Science Foundation grant and is working on the history of the first election in India and the history of India's constitutionalism. Welcome, Ornit.
Welcome and congratulations also on winning the prize.
Thank you, Sariyu and Alok, and it's great to be here with you.
Yeah. So let's start off and we can go straight into the book that you've written. And we recommend everybody who's listening to the podcast to read this fantastic book, simply because I never thought a book which is based on mostly bureaucratic correspondence can be so fascinating and tell us a completely different story about the start of India's democracy. And I think I want to start off talking about how this tells us the origins of electoral democracy. How did you discover, and perhaps the process of how you discovered these documents and what troubles it took you. The methodology, I think, it is fascinating in and of itself. So maybe if you could start by telling us.
And even, as you talk about the book, why electoral rolls would be interesting to talk about as well, because there's quite a lot of literature that talks about, looking at processes or institutions or laws that hold India's democracy intact despite the diversity, but why the electoral process itself and why electoral rolls, most importantly.
Yeah, I know, rolls, lists, sounds like a very boring thing, and I became very excited about it. So, the book started with a question I had, and I didn't get a good answer for. I simply asked senior electoral officials in India, how India prepared the first list of voters before the first elections. And the reason I asked this question, at the time I was working on citizenship at the time of independence. And, I of course was very familiar with the fact that all this was happening in the midst of partition was taking place. Of course, the straightforward so-called place to go to look into was the Constituent Assembly. But it was at that context of thinking about citizenship and thinking of what does it mean in practice to be a citizen, right? We're not waking up every morning and say, I'm a citizen of India. What does it mean? It means when I have, when I can go and vote, I can use my rights, etc. And the question came like this, and I've been taking part in a very interesting conference over the last 18 years almost of election commission or electoral commissioners from the Commonwealth. And where, once a year, election management bodies, representatives of them are coming, meeting together in Cambridge. And it's during these conferences that, questions about elections and the difficulty of preparing accurate electoral rolls came. And it was these two things that brought together discussion. Hang on, India had the first elections in late 1951, early 1952. When did they do the electoral rolls? I knew that just before independence, under the 1935 Act, almost about a fifth of the population had the right to vote, and the franchise was so restricted. Now it was fully universal franchise. And I asked this question, didn't get a good answer. And I was referred to the report. And I said I didn't get a good answer because the report had just 2 pages or so saying something about the Constituent Assembly of India did preparatory work on electoral roll already in 1947. I went to the Constituent Assembly debates that are available online for everyone. I couldn't find anything in the debates. I tried to look at archive about the Constituent Assembly. There were no materials. And I then, looked at different archives and then convinced for a while the Election Commission to try and let me search with them in their records. Maybe something exists in their record. They insisted that nothing exists. But then they allowed me, and I went down with the record keeper. He showed me these beautifully, preserved archive documents they have on each election. And there's nothing. He showed me that there's nothing. And at the end of this, big basement, far away on the floor, there was a pile of files, and I asked to look at them. And sure enough, when I was able to kind of clear the thick layer of dust, I saw 1948, and I was jumping as these were the files. And so I worked for a while on these files in the record room of the Election Commission of India. Then within a year or two, they were passed on to the National Archive of India, where they are available now. So in fact, why? So just to go back to your question about why lists, why electoral rolls, because I was in a way interested in the practice. What does it mean to actually be a citizen? What does it mean to be a right-bearing citizen in practice? And the list was a vantage point.
And I think one of the very interesting things which yesterday you were in conversation with Srinath Raghavan, and also something that comes through from your book, is the idea for a lot of people that just being on these roads, even before they exercise their right to vote, seem to have an impact on the way they perceive themselves as citizens and not subjects. And I think you give a lot of good instances from your book about how this process started to go about.
So, I think it really starts with the question of partition refugees.
Right.
And this becomes the first challenge when they actually, they take a long time to devise the instructions to how, they needed to devise instructions of how to do the rolls. I remind you, there was no constitution, there were no citizenship provisions, there were no, so they had to devise these instructions. But once they start to actually prepare the rolls, the first challenge is the question of how shall we register partition refugees? Why? The refugees didn't have the two basic criteria that one needed in order to be on the electoral roll. You had to be adult, 21, but the two criteria I'm talking about, you had to be a citizen and you had to have a place of residence for 180 days in the place where you were registering. Now, citizenship was not clear. It was not clear to everyone, definitely for partition refugees, because the big question in India at the time was, who is an Indian? Who is an Indian was the most contested question. And just as a kind of side footnote, the debates on citizenship in the Constituent Assembly were very fierce debate, and they couldn't agree on anything. It ultimately was resolved only in August 1949. It was deferred until very late in the constitutional debate. So citizenship was not clear, but residents, the refugees didn't have 180 days. They just came. There were about 18 million refugees across the country. But it comes mainly not just from the areas of Assam and Bengal, but from other areas as well, of officials asking, how should we register these people? And it is at that point where they realize, so two things happen at the same time. On the one hand, they start to enumerate people, refugees who are, very vocal and are there, know that this is happening, right? Because there are press notes and it's clear that this is being done, and they're initially not being registered when it happens. But they understand. People understand very quickly. People who are in some way or another are stateless at that moment understand that, in fact, while it's not clear who is an Indian, being on the electoral roll is the most concrete way of being an Indian. Yes. And they understand. So this is about having a stake in the state. So pressures start to come from many refugees organizations and all kind of civic organizations sending letters to the Constituent Assembly Secretariat that oversees this process of the registration of the preparation of the electoral roll, saying you need to register us too. They're not ready. We have to be on the roll. And they take 4 months to devise a way of doing it. And I think I want to say two or three important things about it. So while they think about how we should register all refugees, and one thing to say about these bureaucrats, one, they immediately say the refugees are always on the move. They won't have the residence. Many people will be disenfranchised. So we have to find a way to include them. So the value of inclusion was the leading, that was the leading value, the underlying value. The second thing they say, we have to find an all India solution, a solution that will be uniform for all India. And they say, let's first look at precedents. What happened in Europe after the Ottoman Empire collapsed and they had to naturalize people? And so that's happening on the one hand. On the other hand, you have all these refugees organizations that start to send all these letters. And what happens in Bengal, Assam is not exactly the same. So in West Bengal, they start to register as refugees. They even start to issue for them citizenship, which they couldn't do, right? They had to cancel that initially. So these letters, this is what start to push this thing about being on the roll, having a stake, etc. But maybe we should actually say what was the solution, because I think that's one of the most impressive things.
Yes.
So it took 4 months, where the solution ultimately was that for the time being, we register all refugees on the mere declaration by them that they commit to reside where they're being registered.
That is hugely significant in terms of thinking about what, how ideas of citizenship have evolved and how we think about ourselves as Indian. And in fact, it was an observation during my fieldwork as well, was that one of the first, and I looked at communities of migrant workers that had come into the city and were looking to sort of become citizens of the city in that sense. And the first step that anybody undertook when they came in was to get on the electoral roll. So there is a lot of energy and time and political intimidation also therefore focuses on getting people onto the electoral list, because it is that entry point which allows you to enter, imagine yourself as a citizen of the city, but also think about ways in which you can access welfare or benefits. Exactly. So there's an instrumental benefit that comes from being on the electoral roll.
And it's more than that. So it's, on the one hand, it's, understanding at the time, right, when I'm talking about the first time, and there was a lot of efforts to explain it to people that you are becoming the sovereigns. Yeah. You are going to choose your government. So there was something momentous about that at the time. But as you say, if we look ahead, it's not that being on the electoral, once this process, was over and the constitution came into force, being on the electoral roll is not a proof of citizenship, right? The two things are separate. But in India, where for a very long time, I'm talking before Aadhaar, but for a very long time, people didn't have documents that show their legal identity. There's no birth certificates to everyone. So legal identity in India has been for a long time, wasn't uniform in terms of providing identification to get your ration card, so the elector, being on the electoral roll was instrumental for that, exactly as you say.
Yes, and in very many ways, the moment I would start an interview, people would say, here is my voter ID card, and they would show it to me as sort of a way to, establish, I don't know what, but that sense that there is a stake in what they're talking about. And so it was quite fascinating to see. And also for what it did for women in terms of the privacy the voting booth offered, but the idea that you as an individual are on the electoral roll. So
two things about that. One is, you're saying that people immediately showed you their electoral rights, and so one thing that and there's one thing that comes in the process of the preparation of the rolls, I think, which is, one of the things I argue, I would say in the book, is that Indians became voters before they were citizens, because they all were voters before actually they became citizens when the constitution came into force. Yeah. So when you think about what was the identity of all Indian as an identity at the moment of the founding, was an identity of we're all voters. So there is an added value which is beyond the instrumental fact of, so a place on the roll is not simply a place that mark your right, right? It's beyond that. In the book I say a place on the roll is your title deed to democracy.
Yes.
And it's a sentence that is the new title deed. It really fits into exactly what you described that you encounter in your research. But these are the historical roots of that. So there's an added value, which is about what is at the moment of founding, what was our identity. We're all voters. And when we say we're all voters, we say something beyond that. We say we're all equal voters. It's one woman, one man, one vote, all. It doesn't matter if you're a Dalit, a tribal, what caste you are. It's irrespective of religion, caste, creed. And this was one of the most incredible things that were done through what we started the conversation, talked about the boring bureaucratic list. So I think it's not boring.
Well, it gives me goosebumps, like I read your book in 2018 when it was published, and my fieldwork was 2014 and 15, like 3 or 4 years before. And it took me back instantly, and it still gives me goosebumps now. But the idea of what it means to be on an electoral roll. So that is
and
absolutely
for me, that was another thing, right? Because I think I said it yesterday. It's like after 17 general elections, so many state elections since independence, it's like it's taken for granted.
Yeah.
Being a voters list is like, it's so obvious. But for me, at the moment when I was thinking, so India had to prepare, the fact was I was thinking the basic thing you need for an electoral democracy is an as accurate as humanly possible electoral roll.
Yeah.
That's the edifice for electoral democracy. Because if you don't have a proper list of voters, people would not believe in the process, the results would not be recognized. So this is the basic thing for an edifice of electoral democracy. You need many other things, but you cannot without a list that people will trust, that they know they're there, etc. And I thought, so how did they do that? I mean, like, India, villages, it's like refugees, I knew the conditions. So, for me, it was thinking about this list was, the understanding of, yes, in fact, that was a very deeply hierarchical society, etc.
Absolutely. But picking up on the notion of deeply hierarchical, the context within which this was made was the post-colonial bureaucracy. Like it was. So how did that process unravel? And you talk about it a lot in the book, and you spoke about it yesterday in the session at the BLF as well. But we'd love to discuss that in terms of how did it operate? How did the formerly colonial bureaucracy itself accept the idea of equal citizenship, of adult franchise, and then go about preparing the role?
Yeah, because indeed, as you say, it's not that, as I said yesterday, it's too good to be true. You can't transform bureaucrats, right? And let's just stop for a second, because to say something, I'm telling a story that is a glorious story, and there's no way to deny it. It's an inspiring story, but not to idealize it. At the same time that some bureaucrats were working on making electoral rolls to institutionalize procedural equality for the purpose of voting, other bureaucrats were, telling people they are intending evacuees and they had to go to Pakistan and took the properties of Muslims, etc. So, there were other things happening at the same time. So we should not just idealize the picture. But going back to that point, so it's not that you can transform bureaucrats, but what is happening, and this is the very clever thing that the Constituent Assembly Secretariat did. They didn't simply sit in their room in Delhi, wrote nice instructions and sent it to the provinces. And I'm reminding you, there were many, many princely states that, at the time, like 552 princely states ultimately integrated into India by 1950. And, we tend to think that the integration was finished by 15th of August when rulers signed the instrument of accession. Not all the rulers signed the instrument of accession. So many of them signed it only in December 47, even into early 1948. B, the instrument of accession only enforced legally the sovereignty of the ruler. They only exceeded on 3 subjects: defense, finance, communication. Otherwise, they were rulers, and the ruling of the Indian Supreme Court from the early 50s that actually, make that very, very clear. So, it's not that they sent these princes, states, and provinces. They decided to do a consultation across the country. And that is amazing how they realize that, there are different conditions in different local contexts. And so they sent a letter to all provinces and states asking them, saying, this is what we're going to do. We're going to do this electoral roll because we realize it's going to be a colossal operation. We need to have the first election as soon as possible after the Constitution comes into force to enact universal franchise. What do you think might be the problems that would come up? How do you think you would solve them? So, the way I was thinking about it when I wrote the book was they were, in effect, doing an exercise of democratic, guided democratic imagination. Yeah. They asked them, imagine this. Imagine you need to do a list of everyone. Imagine you need to put on one list, not separate lists for Hindus, Muslims, different lists for women, for labor, for commerce. No, imagine one list. How will you do it? What are the problems? And this starts a process of 4 months of ongoing correspondences between officials in the states and the provinces and the Secretariat of the Constituent Assembly with feedback. A letter that arrives from Travancore, the princely states of Travancore, that had its elections on first-time elections on the basis of universal franchise for a very small population at the time, inspires the constitutional advisor, B.N. Rao. He gives this letter to the Undersecretary, K.V. Padmanabhan, and he tells him, please look at it and figure out, and write up a plan for India as a whole nation. That's actually, there is a note, handwritten note of B.N. Rao saying a plan for India as a whole nation. And that's the basis for the instruction. So it's done in a consultative manner for a long time, and there's ongoing interaction and correspondence over that. B, once the process starts, it's, it doesn't transform, but it's it's imbibed into the bureaucracy. Problems arise constantly. So it's the solving of problems, and it's solving not theoretical, philosophical problems of should we have this clause or this provision and what. No, it's about very practical issues that we need to solve. It's on that basis of solving bureaucratic issues, of preparing accurate lists that in fact make it real and make bureaucrats, some of them committed to that because they do their job professionally and properly, and others have to redress and correct and do the job again when complaints come, and complaints are being addressed immediately. So, you mentioned previously, Alok, how we talked about the letters from the refugees.
Yeah.
I think the most amazing thing about these letters is that once a letter came to the desk of the Secretariat of the Constituent Assembly, they answered every letter within a week or two.
Wow.
So they so the point was that it's not that people just were, shouting their, complaints, grievances. These things were addressed immediately. And this long process of democratic dialogue, interactions, correspondence between and within, among bureaucrats at different levels and between bureaucrats and the people is part of what did it. And, Sarah, you talked about goosebumps, and I mentioned this. I think my moment of big goosebumps in the archive was bumping into a letter from a collector from Bombay. So a bureaucrat, right, who writes and says, we started to do the electoral rolls. What about all the people that live in the streets?
Yeah.
There are lots of them in Bombay. How shall we register them? And, it's that moment. So it's that moment where, I thought if a bureaucrat, was proactively, it wasn't on the basis of a complaint of anyone, proactively seeing people that otherwise were invisible to them, that shows you that a change was, trickling down.
Absolutely. And it's fascinating that even in enrollment for Aadhaar now, there is a process for enrollment of those who do not have a fixed home. It's the informant process. It is now very much a process or a part of any effort of the state to count or enumerate its citizens. So whether it's the census, whether it's electoral rolls, there is inherent in it a process to find ways to incorporate those who don't have homes. And it's fascinating how that. Of course, this politics that surrounds it now, and I'm sure it continues to sort of not be ever apolitical, but it's amazing that this might have incepted.
I would make one distinction, and the distinction is that when you enumerate people as prospective electors, as voters, the difference between that form of enumeration and other, you don't count them. You really take them into account. You turn them into the sovereigns, into the rulers, and the government is going to be their servants. So, it's just that there's a slight, I think I want to give a bit more weight to the kind of registration, but I totally agree with you that this is the origins of, in fact, part of what electoral democracy is doing and state building is that, the state starts to see in a quote unquote, those who formerly were invisible. And one more thing that I want to say I said there were 2 seconds, two moments of kind of big bureaucrats. So, this collector I mentioned, but the other important thing that I think resonates with the present and needs to be said is a letter that comes from an senior official from West Bengal when they finished the draft electoral roll in West Bengal, and he writes, well, the rolls are almost finished, but I hope you understand, he writes to the Secretariat of the Constituent Assembly, I hope you understand that the work will never finish in a final sense. So, bureaucrats understood that it's not simply that there'll always be new 21-year-old that should be registered, to really take it beyond that. It's democracy is not something that you settle once and for all. It's like we have to be vigilant and work on it and nourish it and move it every day again and again.
Yeah, and I think which is where it's a nice step to go into what this discussion over citizenship and electoral democracy today is at. And we have seen how the NRC process in Assam has taken place, and everything that you just said. We've had the opposite of that happening, where far from inclusion, we've had large-scale exclusion. And that's also because, and in some sense, the imagination was to exclude. We take for granted how important that imagination to include is, but the imagination was to exclude. But your book also deals towards the fag end of it, the incipient debate in Assam over who should be included and who shouldn't be. And that sort of tells us that while a lot of things were settled and taken for granted, a lot of things were still, and as you just ended on that note, it was never complete. There was always going to be contestation also about the agenda of inclusion and exclusion. And I thought we could talk a little bit about that, how it played out in, say, Assam, when you had a large number of course, West Bengal had this, there was so much of an issue, but in Assam, there was a set of issues which sort of came through.
Yeah, so, talking about, 1947 to 1949, 15 Assam, I think one of the interesting things is that the people who were disenfranchised at the time, refugees that were disenfranchised, were not Muslims, it was Hindus, Bengali Hindus, and it was on the basis of a language issues, right? It was the Assamese versus Bengali. Yeah. So the fault lines of disenfranchisement and conflicts were around that, not around, so who we are really, we Assamese, right? And that, and from that perspective, an electoral roll that includes everyone, that was the concrete way of making all Indians. And I think the important point is the point you made. Yeah. What was the value that underlay the whole process? And the value was inclusion. Yeah. Inclusion, and it's not making everyone equal. Yeah. No, it was making everyone equal voters, totally equal for a very narrow purpose, for the purpose of voting, for the purpose of authorizing their government. And that was very, very transformative. You can imagine the landowner and the tenant and,
the sharecropper.
Standing on the same line, right? On the same line, which, kind of symbolizes the equality. Each of them have his, ballot paper, which they have the same weight, etc. So, this is on the one hand. The other side of it is establishing or putting the edifice for a robust electoral democracy, in fact, doesn't get rid of the particularities of, social conditions and identities. So it's not that it automatically erased those identities and particularities of caste and language and class and, no, if anything, it actually opened it up to many, many more identities. Now it's not just a few have the right to, to be voters and to choose their government. It's everyone. It's the scheduled caste. It's the scheduled tribe. Everyone becomes now the part of the compulsions of politics. So much of what we have seen over the years in India, you can see it as also the deepening of democracy. It's true that if I bring it to the present, right, which the present situation in Assam is not directly related to that. It relates to new laws that were enacted from the 80s in India and the war with, today Bangladesh, East Pakistan. But you are right that the very different issue is what is the underlying value. And it was inclusion. And the other thing about it is there was in 1947 to 1950, there was a state building process where these values led for including everyone in the state. And what is happening now, if we try to think about what it means there's a huge project of making statelessness.
Yes.
And this is the other thing. So it's not simply exclusion, it's beyond exclusion. Because as you know from your work, being stateless, meaning, not having a legal identity, you're dehumanized.
Yeah. And also, just on the basis of just this discussion, one other thought occurs to me. Everybody sort of thinks about India's federal structure, but one part of your book where I was reading it, and I was a little bit, I thought of it much later. There's a huge argument about how much do we spend on this. There's an argument about how many reams of paper are needed, how much we should order, who should pay for it, and I thought, oh God, this is so dreary. Let me skip this. But then it occurred to me, wait. I've read this before somewhere. And then I realized that this is actually the start of the discussions between center and state on how to allocate resources. Yeah. So even before the Indian Constitution has a formal federal structure, a fight over money and cost of paper tells you that it wasn't just the states taking instructions from the center. It was a back and forth. Like you gave the example of Travancore writing to the center saying, actually, you know what, we think this is how it should be done. And the center saying, oh, well, this is a great idea. I think this is how it should be done. I think different states have different takes on how the process should be done. And maybe that, I suppose, showed that there was the beginnings of what eventually became India's federalism.
Yeah, I think, one thing is that there are local contexts, and while, the instructions to prepare the roles were ultimately very uniform, there was enough space for some flexibility because of different local contexts. For example, every province at the time, state, could do the roles in their own local language, or think about determining the age of voters. I mean, it was clear that it won't be easy. People don't have simply birth certificates. So that was also open to local officials to find what's the best way. Is it lists in police, in schools, in, how to go about it. In some places, astrological charts, which so many people have, etc. So there was this flexibility. The local context was taken into account seriously. But going to the beginning of what you said, when I encountered all these files about the cost of the electoral roll, because that I thought was like, this is really boring. I mean, because this is unimportant. But in fact, and as you saw, I have a full chapter that deals with the question, who is going to pay for it? And the question who is going to pay for it ultimately is very critical, not just because of who is going to pay simply, but if you as a state that claim to have your own autonomy as part of the big federation says, well, no, you, the center, should pay for that. You actually give legitimacy to the existence of the state. And so, this was exactly about how we figure out, this was the beginning, as you say, of figuring out the relations. And it was nice that ultimately here, even though there were many debates about it, they actually split the cost. It was 50-50.
Right? And the debates keep coming back with the one nation, one election kind of debates in terms of, because it's a costly exercise, it should all happen at the same time and all of that. So,
but here the principle is held to, right? It's neither the state nor the center is willing to concede on the other's point. And so they okay, as long as we agree on the principle, maybe a 50-50 split works out for both of us. But I think before we sort of wind up, two major exclusions, which you mentioned in the book, and even an inclusive exercise can result in exclusions because things beyond possible.
There were limits to this inclusion.
One major set of exclusions were women. We had mentioned a lot of women were excluded for the reason they didn't have a name. And this, to us sitting here in 2019, it seems so alien. The idea that people didn't have a name, or if they did, they refused to give it out, or three, they were removed from the list for refusing to give their name. It feels like such an alien idea, but I think we have to, accept that we're talking about a very different social setting. But I wonder how people found ways to overcome this.
Yeah, so this is a very important thing that I would love to say a few more words about that. So in some parts of India, so what's happening when they start to do the rolls already in 48, and it starts, complaints are coming about it from UP initially, but from Bihar as well, is the district officers report that women in some areas refuse to register in their own name. And the idea is that when you register someone in the electoral roll, they have to register in their own name as individuals, not as part of a community. So it's, you make them equal individuals. But they wanted to register because of custom, especially women who were observing Purda, living in seclusion. So they were registered, they wanted, so it's, in some families they didn't want, there were occasions of not letting the women register, but in some places it was registering them as wife of, daughter of, widow of, in relation to the men in the family. Now, this practice was accepted by colonial officials under the 1936-37 elections. The same problem occurred there because of social customs in one places where women don't have, once they're married, or they don't have their identity. Their identity is inherently, linked to the identity of the male relations. So under colonial elections, and just, the elections of, 37 and 46, it was accepted. And in fact, there were official procedures. In case there was a form, in case a woman doesn't want to be registered in her own name, she should be registered as a wife of A, B, C, widow of A, B, C. And that was the case. And people on the ground said, well, that's what we did. And the government now said, no, now you are individuals. You have to be registered in your own name. And, at the beginning of the process in UP, for example, they also, the government organizes propaganda vans and women activists to do that. What is happening is and that's during the process. What is happening is and that's after the Constitution, when they published very late in 1950, when they published the provision, the draft rules for making claims and objections, so people will see if they're on the roll, if there's a need to correct their names, additions, supplementary rights. So many people turned 21 since then, etc. Then they realized there are lots of, and then the work by then, once the Constitution comes into force, the whole work moves from the Constituent Assembly Secretariat to the Election Commission of India, that is only putting, the first Chief Election Commissioner is appointed in March 1950. So it starts to work there. And of course, there's work to do on the supplementary role and so many other things that has to be happening, delimitation of constituencies, ballot papers, etc., etc. But then they realized that there are these women whose name, you say they didn't have a name, they had the name of a wife of, etc.
Oh, yeah.
And they said, the Chief Election Commissioner is saying, no, they have to correct this because there is a law now. Yeah. And the law, by now there is a law. There is the representation of the People Act, April 1950. It's about registration. You have to be registered in your own name. Yeah. So, the law created a limit where there was not enough flexibility to change it, but they make a lot of efforts in many places to, they extend the time by quite a few months. They relax the way of women, so they relax the whole procedure for doing it. So, for example, women don't necessarily have to come and fill form, but registering officers can do that. Yeah. But ultimately, in many places it was corrected, but not in Rajasthan. In Rajasthan, there were still many women. So the Election Commission estimated that ultimately 2.8 million women out of 80 million women were struck off the roll. So those were in the first elections. And the Chief Election Commissioner, Sukumar Sen, was very open about it. He gave a radio broadcast about it. He talked at a press conference about it before the first election. And he said, there is nothing we can do now because anything now will defer the first elections and we can't do that. And just two things about it. One is once it became clear, there's huge amount of women association and activists that start to, struggle for the registration of these women. And there are lots of efforts in Rajasthan. It doesn't really happen, not much of it changes, but 2 weeks after the end of the first elections, the Election Commission sent circular to many officials across, to around the country to say, you start now to work on the registration of all these women correctly. And a huge amount of work is done on that in order to ensure that these women are going to be registered properly for the second elections. Mm-hmm. So, yeah,
that's fascinating. And even in fieldwork, women that I would interview would often say that's truly the only place where I am seen for myself and not as wife of somebody else. It doesn't matter because it is about my identity.
And we think that it took time, but like I read it's kind of a diary of a first parliamentarian who talks about how he's going to his constituency and a friend hosts him and he talks to the gardener of the guy that he knows him for many years and he says, Babu, I'm about to be a parliamentarian, I'm standing for election, that's at the end, I'll vote for you. And he said, what about your wife? And he said, how will I know? We're talking about 1950. How will I know? Communist promises are a lot of other things.
But a second exclusion, which you sort of mentioned, and it goes to the Naga tribes, who sort of weren't formally included. And apart from them, also other Adivasis, who sort of weren't formally included in the lists as far as I understand. And it was only much later that all of this started. But we also see that they never saw themselves as part of the Indian state, even though they did, as you mentioned, they did come and make certain claims. Whether they saw themselves as part of the Indian state is also up for question, because that it's not fully certain as well, because we still have this ongoing debate about ongoing talks with Naga tribes. And this sort of, I suppose, tells us two things. One, of course, that the roots of what a lot of problems in India are right now. And I was just thinking of this one statistic of Rajasthan, I think, practices the maximum amount of face covering in India among women. Still, I think about 85-90% of women in Rajasthan use veils or burqas in some form, whereas it can go as low as 0% or 1% in other states. The problem doesn't go away, but we find a way to get around it. And likewise with the Naga issue, but also perhaps the roots of what we consider India's electoral democracy perhaps were laid down very deep. And it isn't just that in the last few years, just merely turnout isn't the best way to understand how people really perceive elections and the way they are. And they there was a sense of belonging which came right at the start itself. It took a while for maybe to get to 95-99%, but I think that the roots were laid fairly deep right in the beginning. And I think that is sort of what tells us about, and which is why I still think this is a book of hope. I think I would still say, this is still a hopeful book, because in a sense, what it tells us is that, one, it is possible to imagine things that people dismissed as impossible. When you talk about universal suffrage, India was, I think, the first country which on the day of independence granted universal suffrage. After that, many other countries do, but I can't think of too many other countries where on the date of independence itself, or rather on the day of becoming a republic, granted this universal suffrage.
Absolutely. And in fact, we live in complex political times, and what I tell myself is that it struck me very instantly right as I started fieldwork, and sort of now it is something that I think about very often. The first measure of self in some ways for people in the cities or migrants into the cities, that is having a voter ID, and that sense of participation in the democracy, that sense of belonging in some ways, and that sense of seeing oneself as visible to the state is truly, it gives me hope. And we had this discussion yesterday as well, but the democracy is deep in that sense. But I mean, and I can't help get over this, but even today, the list-making process is not over, and it is something that's ongoing. But there is an everyday politics to it, because political parties do intermediate the way in which the citizen is seen by the state, or the way in which the citizen sees the state. And I think there's Co-Bridges work. There's quite a lot of work that talks about that process of access more broadly to the state, but even list-making in that sense. And, It is entrenched, it is instinctive, it is natural for both the bureaucracy and the citizens in some ways to see themselves as part of the state, but it is still mediated by everyday politics. Like local politicians will not give out voter ID cards or will hold back on submitting documents of people that they think will not vote for them. And that is used as a way in which to ensure vote banks in some ways. And so that, I think, remains a problematic way in which political structures intermediate to in this process.
So that goes back, I agree with the things you're saying, but the last thing you said, Sarah, goes back to the thing that, when the work can never end in a final sense, also on the onus is also on the citizen. So one of the things that comes from the book, from this story, which is, as I say, it's a story about hope and imagination, is that people were very vigilant about having a place on the roll. And if we're not going to be vigilant about the way we're being governed, this is something that Gandhi gave this country, the idea of to oversee the way you're being governed. It's not enough to put your ballot, to press the voting machine and I chose my representative. It's you have to oversee the way you're governed. So nothing, I can imagine easily how much massive disenfranchisement would have taken place during the first, when they did the first rolls, if people would not have written to the Secretariat Assembly, and if the Secretariat Assembly would have not taken seriously every letter and come back to it. We don't know. The fact is that we don't know about, I know about only what I could see that arrived to the desk of the Constituent Assembly Secretariat. I can imagine that a lot of things, disenfranchisement and bad things that didn't arrive were not taken care of. What arrived to their desk was taken care of. So in a way, there is some onus on the citizens to also, not to rely on intermediaries and these, systems that come into place over the years, and have their own, guts and right to go directly to the institutions. And I think that has been happening as well in India over the years. We have a bit of retreat, with, amendments to the RTI and all these things that you talk about at the present. But this is where, this is one of the points about we as citizens, we have to continuously oversee the way we're being governed.
Absolutely.
I think that on that note, I think we can sort of come to the end of this episode. We have almost run out of time. Thank you so much, Ornit, for joining us. This was a wonderful discussion.
I would urge all our listeners to go read the book, because I think we've discussed, just touched the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more in it.
And we seriously look forward to your next book, which is going to be on the very first election in India. And I'm sure that's also going to tell us a fascinating underexplored part of Indian history. Thank you so much once again for joining us on this episode.
Thank you, Ornit.
Thank you, Sarai. Thank you, Alok. Thanks.
And thank you all for tuning in. Do stay tuned for more episodes next Wednesday.
I hope you enjoyed that show. We'd like to thank our sponsors this week, Intel, Storytel, and Cambly. And let me tell you a couple of things that you should check out this week. On Mr. and Mrs. Binge Watch, Janice and Aryu talk about Season 3 of Netflix historical drama The Crown, and they list the TV shows and original movies they're looking forward to in the month of December. On Geek Fruit, Tejas is joined by fellow geek Vikas Munipale, and they talk about the ever-expanding world of video games. On Know Your Kanun, Amber talks about the Transgender Persons Bill of 2019 and highlights the problems that one must look at in the bill. On Edges and Sledges, Ashwin, Varun, and DJ talk about all that went down in the pink ball test, speculate about MS Dhoni's retirement, and look ahead to India's T20s versus West Indies. On Golgappa, Trupti is joined by Aarti Vadak-Balkar. She talks about experimenting with one's comfort zone as an actor and her brand Color Chop. On Paperback, Rachita and Satyajit are joined by writer Dishant Huria, who discusses his first published novel called When Karma Goes Upside Down. Thanks and keep listening.
Remember the last vacation you took? What about the one you took 3 years ago? Okay, how much do you really remember? It's a question I've asked myself often over a decade of traveling the world. Hey, I'm Utsav, and I do not travel the world for a living. I have a full-time job and responsibilities, but I have made traveling the world a priority. Priority enough that I negotiate extra leave in my job contracts, obsessively track my frequent flyer miles, and I'm willing to take off at the sight of a cheap ticket. Yes, I am cheap. I have lived and worked in 3 countries. I understand human behavior for a living, and these experiences have given me unique insights into places, people, and culture. With over a decade of travel behind me, I increasingly realized one thing, that we cannot see everything. So whatever we see, we must see deeply. Because as the film of memory decays, the imprints which will stand the test of time are the ones felt by the immersion of the senses, not by fleeting encounters with them. Postcards from Nowhere is an immersion into the world of slow travel, one story at a time. Tune in every Thursday on the IVM Podcasts app, website, or wherever you get your podcast from.